There is an old belief that sounds responsible on the surface. Rest should be earned. It is repeated in quiet ways, in disciplined households, in ambitious classrooms, in workplaces that praise exhaustion as if it were character, in families where stillness is mistaken for laziness, where worth is measured by output, where a person is loved most easily when they are useful. It sounds practical, even noble, but beneath that belief, something more painful often grows. Because when rest becomes something that must be deserved, exhaustion stops being a signal and becomes a test of morality, a test of discipline, a test of whether you have done enough to justify your own humanity for one more day. And that is where guilt enters. Not ordinary guilt, the kind that belongs to harm or repair. Not the guilt that rises when something in another person has been bruised and needs acknowledgement. This is a different kind, a quieter kind, a guilt that arrives when nothing wrong has happened at all. You lie down and something in you tightens. You sit still and your mind begins producing accusations. You take an afternoon off and instead of relief, there is unease. A subtle internal whisper asking whether this softness is allowed, whether this pause has been paid for, whether there is something unfinished watching you from the corner of the room. And so the body is still, but the nervous system is not. This is the deeper story of people who feel guilty for resting. They are not simply driven, not simply hardworking, not simply ambitious in the flattering way the world likes to describe. Often, something more complex is happening beneath the surface. Something old, something emotional, something learned so early that it no longer feels like a learned pattern at all. It feels like truth, as if rest is dangerous, as if slowness is suspicious, as if being unproductive for too long might expose something shameful. And perhaps the strangest part is how invisible this can look from the outside. A person who feels guilty for resting may seem impressive, reliable, disciplined, motivated. The one who keeps going, the one who rarely stops. The one who handles more than anyone realizes. The one other people admire because they are always moving, always managing, always doing something useful. But admiration can conceal wounds very easily. Sometimes what looks like discipline is fear with a neat haircut. Sometimes what looks like ambition is panic made socially acceptable. Sometimes what looks like strength is a person who does not know how to be still without feeling unworthy. That is the hidden ache. Because rest, in its healthiest form, is not indulgence. It is not moral weakness. It is not a reward reserved only for the people who have reached the end of every task. Rest is part of being alive. The body requires it. The mind requires it. The heart requires it. Every living system moves in rhythms. Expansion and contraction. Tension and release. Day and night. Effort and recovery. Even the earth does not bloom without seasons of apparent stillness. So what happens when a human being begins to feel ashamed of one half of the rhythm? What happens when stopping feels heavier than continuing? Usually, that pattern begins long before adulthood. No child is born feeling guilty for needing rest. A child sleeps when tired. A child drifts off in the middle of noise. A child reaches the edge of overwhelm and collapses naturally into it without moral interpretation. Fatigue is simply fatigue. Need is simply need. Then somewhere along the way, need becomes complicated. Maybe the child grows up in a home where rest is treated as laziness. Maybe stillness is met with criticism. Maybe the adults around them are always overworked, always stressed, always caring too much. And there is an unspoken atmosphere in the house that says busyness is virtue. Maybe love feels warmest when the child is helping, achieving, performing, or staying out of the way. Maybe praise comes most consistently when they are productive, responsible, exceptional, and mature beyond their years. Children do not understand systems. They understand patterns. They notice when approval comes after achievement. They notice when tenderness arrives more easily after usefulness. They notice which versions of themselves create less tension in the room. And so the nervous system begins making quiet conclusions. Do more. Be helpful. Stay ahead. Do not become heavy for anyone. Do not be caught doing nothing. Do not relax too much. Do not need too much. Do not become one more burden in a world that already looks burdened. This is how rest starts losing its innocence. Not all conditioning is loud. Not every wound arrives in dramatic language. Sometimes no one says, "You do not deserve rest." No one has to. The message is built through repetition, through tone, through glances, through household weather, through the sigh when you are sitting down while someone else is working, through the praise for being the good one, the responsible one, the hard worker, the one who never complains, through the subtle disappointment that seems to gather around softness. And eventually, the person learns not only to work, but to monitor themselves while resting. That is an important distinction. A person can be physically resting while psychologically braced. They can be lying in bed with a pulse that still feels like obligation. They can be on a day off while mentally drafting tomorrow. They can be on vacation while internally apologizing for not producing. They can be sitting in silence while feeling chased by invisible hands. This is why guilt for resting is so exhausting. It steals the very thing rest is supposed to restore. While the body pauses, the mind prosecutes, and often the person does not understand why. They may tell themselves a flattering story, that they just have high standards, that they are simply disciplined, that they like staying busy, that they are built this way, that they get uncomfortable with doing nothing because they are ambitious, because they care, because they are not lazy like other people. But beneath that story, another truth may be waiting. What if the discomfort is not coming from noble drive, but from an identity built around earning safety through usefulness? What if productivity became more than behavior? What if it became protection? This is where the pattern becomes deeply psychological. For many people, busyness is not merely about accomplishment. It is regulation. It is control. It is proof. Proof that they matter. Proof that they are trying. Proof that they are not falling behind. Proof that they are not wasting their life. Proof that they are not the disappointing version of themselves they fear might exist underneath stillness. And when work becomes proof of worth, rest begins to feel like evidence against you. Evidence that you are slipping. Evidence that you are becoming less impressive. Evidence that others are moving while you are fading. Evidence that there is something hollow beneath all that effort, so you keep moving. Not always because the next task is urgent. Sometimes because stopping would force you into the company of yourself. And for many people, that is where the real discomfort lives. Because stillness has a way of revealing what movement conceals. When the emails stop, when the deadlines loosen, when the room grows quiet and your hands are no longer occupied, certain feelings begin rising like sediment disturbed at the bottom of a river. Sadness that had no slot in the schedule. Anger that never felt safe enough to name. Emptiness that productivity had been covering like wallpaper over a cracked wall. Loneliness, fear. The strange grief of realizing how much of your life has been organized around staying in motion. Sometimes guilt for resting is not only guilt. Sometimes it is dread disguised as guilt. Dread of what silence might say. Dread of what the body might finally admit. Dread of discovering that exhaustion was never only physical. A person who feels guilty for resting may have learned long ago that being busy protects them from inner collapse. When there is always something to do, there is less room to feel. Less room to remember. Less room to question. Less room to touch the parts of the self that have been surviving through momentum alone. That is why rest can feel strangely unsafe. Not because rest harms, because rest reveals. And revelation is not always gentle when someone has spent years outrunning themselves. There is another layer to this that the world rarely speaks about clearly. People who feel guilty for resting are often carrying a hidden fear of being ordinary. They may not say it aloud. They may not even think it in words. But somewhere in the emotional architecture, there may be a belief that if they stop achieving, stop proving, stop exceeding, Something about them becomes less lovable, less visible, less worthy of being chosen or remembered. This is the sadness that often lives beneath overachievement, not confidence. Conditional self-regard. As long as you are producing, there is structure. As long as you are needed, there is identity. As long as you are excelling, there is a reason to feel solid. But what happens when you are simply a person? Not impressive, not useful, not optimized, not performing endurance. Just a human being in need of rest. For some nervous systems, that simplicity feels unbearable because they were not taught that being is enough. They were taught that being good means being valuable, and being valuable means being useful, and being useful means not slowing down too much. This is why rest can trigger shame rather than relief. Shame is rarely only about behavior. It is about identity. It asks not, "What am I doing?" but, "What does this say about me?" So the person lying on the couch is not merely thinking, "I should probably get up." They may be feeling at a much deeper level, "What kind of person am I if I stay here?" That question cuts far deeper than a to-do list. It touches belonging, lovability, self-trust, moral worth. And once those themes fuse with productivity, the entire inner world begins to tilt. Rest is no longer neutral. It becomes charged with meaning. That is why some people cannot enjoy free time without planning how to justify it. Why they need to clean before relaxing, answer one more message before sitting down, finish one more task before exhaling, accomplish enough first to silence the internal judge. Why rest is postponed again and again until the body stops asking politely and begins speaking in headaches, burnout, numbness, resentment, insomnia, heaviness, or that strange, exhausted detachment where everything feels slightly colorless. Because deprivation does not always look dramatic at first. Sometimes it looks admirable. A full calendar, a tidy routine, a high-functioning life, an efficient person who seems to have everything under control. But beneath that polished surface, there may be someone who has forgotten how to receive rest without needing to deserve it first. And that forgetfulness can become a quiet tragedy. Because a person who cannot rest without guilt begins living in constant negotiation with themselves. Every pause must be justified. Every softness must be earned. Every slow moment is shadowed by an internal accountant tallying whether enough has been done. Did you work hard enough? Did you suffer enough? Did you finish enough? Did you help enough? Why did you prove enough to be allowed this hour of stillness? Listen closely, and this begins to sound less like discipline and more like a courtroom. And who is on trial? Usually the self. This is why guilt for resting often lives beside perfectionism. Perfectionism is not really about standards alone. It is often an attempt to prevent shame, disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. If everything is handled flawlessly, perhaps nothing painful will get in. If enough is done, perhaps criticism can be avoided. If the self remains productive and organized and ahead, perhaps vulnerability can stay hidden behind competence. Rest disrupts that illusion. Rest is unguarded. Rest does not perform. Rest allows incompletion to exist for a while. And for someone whose safety has become tied to control, that can feel almost intolerable. There is also the cultural layer, which matters more than people often admit. Many environments train human beings to treat themselves like machines. Faster, better, more optimized, more output from less sleep, more visibility from less peace. The modern world often speaks in the language of achievement so loudly that stillness begins to sound like failure. The person who is always exhausted is called committed. The person who is always reachable is called dedicated. The person who neglects their own limits is often praised before they are pitied, and so the guilt becomes collective as well as personal. You absorb it from family. You absorb it from school. You absorb it from class expectations, social comparison, digital culture, ambition narratives, survival pressures, and the constant low hum of a world that rarely asks whether a human soul can bear this pace. Then one day you are resting, and it feels wrong, but you call it a personal flaw. You call it laziness. You call it weakness. You do not always see how many voices built that reaction inside you. Still, the most powerful voice is often the one that came earliest. The child who learned that love arrived most safely through usefulness often grows into an adult who cannot soften without guilt, because usefulness became more than contribution. It became attachment strategy. It became the way connection was maintained, the way approval was secured, the way emotional danger was reduced. If that child sensed stress in the home, they may have become the helper. If they sensed instability, they may have become the achiever. If they sensed emotional unpredictability, they may have become the one who stayed ahead of everything. Not because children are naturally meant to carry that weight, because adaptation is intelligent, and many patterns that look self-punishing in adulthood were once brilliant forms of survival. This matters, because shame asks, why can't you relax like a normal person? Understanding asks, what did constant effort once protect? Shame says, you are doing this to yourself. Understanding says, something in you learned that stopping might cost too much. That shift is not small. It transforms the pattern from character flaw into biography. It allows a person to see that guilt for resting is often the afterlife of old emotional conditions. A body remembering environments where being easy, useful, productive, or exceptional made life feel safer. And perhaps that is why even pleasure can feel uncomfortable for these people. Not only rest, but joy without utility, joy without productivity, joy that exists for no reason except aliveness, a slow morning, an empty afternoon, a walk with nowhere to arrive, a nap that is not strategic, an evening untouched by performance. Such moments can feel strangely exposed, because if your nervous system has been trained to equate goodness with output, purposeless peace feels like stepping outside the rules of survival. Even beauty can become difficult to receive. You may admire softness in theory while resisting it in practice. You may long for rest and then sabotage it the moment it arrives. You may fantasize about slowing down while filling every silence with one more task. This is not because you do not want peace. Sometimes it is because peace feels unfamiliar enough to trigger alarm. There is grief hidden in that. Grief for all the times the body asked for gentleness and was given pressure instead. Grief for how quickly self-worth can become entangled with usefulness. Grief for the person who learned to outrun collapse by becoming impressive. Grief for the hours of life spent believing that exhaustion was noble and rest was suspicious. And still, within this pattern, there is often something deeply tender. People who feel guilty for resting are often sensitive, conscientious, and highly attuned. They care. They notice what is needed. They do not move through life carelessly. They carry responsibility with seriousness. They want to do well, to be dependable, to contribute, to avoid becoming a burden. Those qualities are not ugly. They are often beautiful. The pain begins when responsibility turns into self-abandonment, when diligence turns into self-surveillance, when contribution turns into the belief that existence must always be justified through labor. That is the line that quietly gets crossed, because a person can be responsible without feeling guilty for breathing slowly. A person can be ambitious without treating rest like moral failure. A person can care deeply and still be allowed moments that are not useful to anyone else. A person can pause without becoming lesser, but if you have lived a long time inside the opposite belief, that kind of permission can feel almost unreal. Perhaps that is why simple acts of rest can feel so emotionally loaded. They do not touch only the present moment. They touch old contracts, old fears, old negotiations with worthiness, the unfinished emotional math of a life spent proving. And maybe that is why when someone finally says, you do not have to earn rest, the sentence can land with unusual force. Not because it is complicated, because it reaches a place that has been bracing for years, a place that thought survival required endless motion, a place that learned to confuse depletion with goodness. A place that has not known what to do with stillness except apologize for it. If that pattern has lived quietly inside you, then perhaps the truth is not that you are weak in the face of softness. Perhaps the truth is that you adapted too well to a world that rewarded your exhaustion. Perhaps you learned to make yourself valuable through movement because stillness never felt sufficiently safe. sufficiently praised, or sufficiently understood. Perhaps guilt became the guard standing at the doorway of rest, asking for credentials every time you tried to enter. And guards are not always cruel. Sometimes they are frightened. Sometimes they were assigned their role by older versions of you who only wanted to keep life from unraveling. Sometimes they do not know that the danger has changed, so the guilt returns, even when no threat is present. It returns in quiet rooms, in unscheduled afternoons, in the first 10 minutes of lying down, in the moment your body finally stops and your mind begins asking whether this softness is deserved. But not every alarm is proof of danger. Sometimes it is proof of history, and history can live inside the smallest moments. Inside the inability to enjoy a Sunday evening. Inside the urge to check messages during a pause. Inside the restlessness that arrives the second the room gets quiet. Inside the compulsion to make every hobby profitable, every talent useful, every spare hour count towards something measurable. A whole worldview can hide inside the inability to do nothing without guilt. A worldview that says, only the productive self is safe. Only the useful self is lovable. Only the moving self is real. But human beings are not rivers meant only to rush. They also pool, settle, reflect, grow quiet. Not because they have failed to move, but because life itself is made of more than motion. There is wisdom in the field that lies fallow. There is restoration in the ember that lowers its glow instead of burning itself to ash. There is truth in the body that stops demanding excellence long enough to admit it is tired. And tiredness is not a moral defect. It never was. So, if this title found you for a reason, perhaps let one softer truth sit beside the harsher ones you have carried. Guilt is not always a sign that you are doing something wrong. Sometimes it is simply the feeling that rises when an old identity is not being fed. Sometimes it is the echo of a life that taught you to trust effort more than ease. Sometimes it is the ache of not yet believing that rest can belong to you before you have proven enough. That ache deserves understanding, because there is nothing shameful about how carefully you learn to survive in systems that praised your depletion. Nothing shameful about the way your mind learned to associate stillness with risk, if stillness once threatened belonging, approval, or control. Nothing shameful about the fact that rest can feel emotionally complicated when so much of your worth has been tied to what you produce. The sadness is not that you care. The sadness is that care may have been turned against yourself. The sadness is not that you value responsibility. The sadness is that responsibility may have swallowed tenderness whole. The sadness is not that you work hard. It is that somewhere along the way, hard work began to feel like the price of existing peacefully inside your own skin. And perhaps that is the deepest wound underneath guilt for resting. Not tiredness itself, but the belief that your stillness must always defend itself. That your body must argue its case. That your softness needs permission. That your pause must come wrapped in evidence. But some things are too fundamental to be earned. Sleep, breath, silence. A moment with no demand attached to it. If this reflection felt uncomfortably familiar, then maybe something quiet has been trying to tell you the story beneath your exhaustion for a very long time. Not only that you are tired, but that you have been carrying worth in the form of labor for too long. Not only that you need rest, but that rest has become entangled with questions it was never meant to answer. Questions about value. Questions about lovability. Questions about whether you are enough when nothing impressive is happening. Those are heavy questions to place on an ordinary moment of stillness. Too heavy. And if no one ever taught you that your life has value even when it is not producing, even when it is not achieving, even when it is not turning pain into performance or effort into proof, then perhaps this is why guilt keeps arriving where peace should be. Not because you're broken, because you learned a hard language too well. A language where only output counts. A language where rest feels like a confession. A language where slowing down sounds like failure, even when it is simply the body asking to be treated like something living instead of something endlessly useful.